Hi everyone. I'm going to talk today on how we set a technical direction at Suvoda and more importantly how we stick to it and the various factors that go into making it so you can stick to that technical direction. Now, I've structured the talk into two parts. The first part is me talking about the happy path, about how we set it up at Suvoda. And by this stage, I've done it so many times, I'm sort of operating off a rule book, off a guidebook. The second part is perhaps the most interesting part, where I look in a set of anti-patterns and I'll relate some of the stories of stuff I've messed up in the past, because as we know as an engineer, experience is proportional to mistakes made. So I'm going to give you the summary right at the start. These are the four things that help you to set a technical direction and also help to make sure you can stick to it. The first thing is it needs to align with the product direction. So at Suvoda, I got brought in by an old friend. He was the ex-chief product officer at LiveRamp, and he said, come over to Suvoda and help us in our next step of our technical journey. And so he's the chief product officer. I can work with him, and we can make sure that we get complete alignment on the product, because essentially it's very dangerous to make technical choices and move in a technical direction that's not helping the product. What's the point, right? And you so often see this disconnection in companies. The second thing is, and this is probably the most important part, right? You set up a North Star. You say where you want to go. This is the ambitious place we want to go. And then you have to devise a very conservative strategy to get there. And conservative can mean different things depending on the different companies. It can mean, let's move very quickly, but try not to break it too much. It can mean in the company I'm at the moment, Suvoda, it's a healthcare company. We deal with complex clinical trials. We have to be a little bit more conservative because we cannot afford to break things. But those two need to be defined in concert. So the North Star as well as the safe way to get there. I used to have this anecdote. It's a bit like you want to drive to get an award. Like say you've won an award for, best actor or something like that. And the last thing you want to do as you're driving along to get that award is to crash your car into a tree, right? So you've got to be very safe even as you set that ambitious goal. The third thing we do, and I've learned to do this very, very well over the years, is to communicate transparently. Everyone needs to know where we're going, why we're going there, and they need to be able to also give us feedback if they don't like it. And we can process that feedback. That's the fourth point. We can process that feedback in ways that gets buy-in. Because what you don't want is you don't want to set up a North Star in an increment and then have lots of people complaining about it behind the scenes in a way where they're never heard. Right? What you want to do is you want to take that feedback and you want to process it in a way that turns them into allies. You want champions of the direction and you want it to permeate right through the whole company. So a little bit about Suvoda. I'll talk a bit more in a second when I have the next slide. But this is the web page of Suvoda. It's a company that's been going for around 10 years, and they produce a SaaS platform that we build on for complex clinical trials. So there's various products that sit on top of that SaaS platform, and what you'll see, I'll read out the byline: seamlessly manage mission-critical, time-sensitive patient interactions with the Suvoda platform, and a purpose-built, easy-to-use ecosystem delivering e-consent, IRT, and eCOA. Now, it's a complex domain, right? Essentially, what we do is clinical trials are a complex beast. There's really three aspects to it that I'll talk about today. There's the consent side. We want you to go into a clinical trial. Can you sign this, read this document, sign it, and agree to the terms for the clinical trial? It could be taking a drug which is experimental. We tend to focus more on the complex end of the spectrum, so oncology and central nervous system disorders. Then there's the IRT part, the interactive response technology. It's basically a drug logistics system which manages patient visits, and it calculates how much of the drug or how much of the placebo the patients get based on the often complex equations or complex scenarios that are outlined in a clinical trial protocol document. These things are sometimes immensely complicated. The randomization side. A typical trial that you might be talking about is a double-blinded randomized trial where you don't know whether you're getting the placebo or not, and neither does the physician administering it to you. And then there's the eCOA side, which stands for electronic clinical outcome assessment. It's where you're given a set of questionnaires at certain times, and these are clinical instruments designed to assess whether or not the treatment is working for you. So as I said, we sit at the complex end of the trial spectrum, and our software has to support immensely complex and often very varied study requirements. Like, we sit at that Ferrari level of customization, and as you'll see, I'm sort of fairly well suited for this because I did my PhD in software extensibility. Company was founded about 10 years ago. There's around 500 plus employees, probably more at this point, maybe 500 to 700. I didn't do a precise count. There's probably about 200 plus engineers, programmers, testers, depending on how you count them. So a little bit about me. This is actually the second part of my working life. My first part, well, actually I could divide it into three phases. I did an electronics engineering degree in Australia and worked in computational linguistics for about 4 or 5 years. Then moved to England and worked in financial services. I worked across investment banks, all sorts of financial institutions for around 15 years, and along the way did a PhD on software extensibility at Imperial College in London. I fell into that because I was working on software components. I read an academic paper that was related to what I wanted to do, and I talked to them and they said, come and do a PhD. Now, about 10 years ago, I got contacted by Riot Games. Riot Games make League of Legends, the massively online multiplayer MOBA game. And they said, come over and interview, and maybe you could move to Santa Monica. So I did that and moved with my family to Santa Monica and worked at Riot Games for about 5 years. When I left, I was architecturally managing a good proportion of the company's sort of projects. I was maybe managing 12. The most important one I probably did when I was there was the game client update, which was the largest project that Riot Games had done up to that point in its lifetime of 7 years at that time. Left there after about 4 or 5 years, went to Hulu as the chief architect. Now, my job at Hulu wasn't really to set technical direction, that was already set. My job was to make sure that the architecture didn't fall apart. We'd created 800 microservices, and so managing that and bringing coherence to the architecture was the thing I really had to do. I left there eventually after we delivered the live TV service and done our first Super Bowl and our first Olympics. And I joined LiveRamp as the chief architect, and managed that for about 2 years. And then eventually through Amazon, joined with the ex-CEO of Hulu, Mike Hopkins. I joined Amazon. And then after about a year there, it's a very difficult place. There's a lot of technical debt, etc. Joined Suvoda with the ex-CPO of LiveRamp, and I've been there for a bit over 2 years now. So how did we manage to set our technical direction at Suvoda, and how are we managing to keep to it? Because we've done it for about 2 years now, and it's been very successful. So what are the components that allow it to be successful? And by this stage, again, this is the first part of the talk. I'll talk about the happy path, about the things we did right. So first we got product clarity. You know, I listed those steps 1 to 4. This is the first step. We talked about where the company sees itself in 5 years. What is the vision? What do the CEO and sales in particular care about? If you can't sell a product, then you don't really have a product. What does the CPO want to see achieved? And the company was at a bit of an inflection point. It's very successful, but now they need a technical overhaul because they've become successful. It's very often the case that you get to an inflection point and then you need to move the company forward. So we discovered they needed to retain that Ferrari level of customization. If you don't have that, then we lose a lot of our big pharmaceutical customers. We needed to increase the efficiency of customization, and we needed the products to be added quickly on top of a SaaS platform and ecosystem that we can add new products more quickly. So that's the platform side. Then we formed an ambitious North Star architecture. And in a nutshell, I won't go into great detail, there's a lot in this. It's a very complex set of systems. But it's essentially, at the core of it, it's a powerful way to manage a set of highly customized systems as a multi-tenant SaaS platform. This is not your usual case of, customer 1 has, modules 1 and 3, and customer 2 has modules 1, 2, and 5. It's not like that. It's much, much more complex, much, much more detailed, because these are very, very complex clinical trials. So it needed to match with the company's ambition. If you don't set a North Star which is ambitious enough, the CEO and the board are going to go, we need to get someone else in to define it for us. And so as a technologist, I'm always looking out for something to make sure the ambition lines up with where they want to take the company. But it has to be achievable by the team, so it's a balancing act, because you've really got to say, well, what is the current team good at? What are we capable of? Now, this is no slight on the team at Suvoda, because they're very, very good. This is just the reality of engineering, that you have to do something that's achievable with the team and the resources that you have. The worst thing in the world is a North Star architecture that sounds really good, everyone wants to get there, but you can't achieve it. And I'm an over-communicator. I've learned this over time. We highlight the benefits of this architecture and outline the characteristics of it all the time. We make sure that people understand why we're going in this direction, what the pros and cons are, and what they can expect along the way. More on that a bit later. Then we have to devise an incremental approach to get there, and you have to do it at the same time. You can't just say, well, here's my North Star, we'll work out a way later. It's a balancing act, as I mentioned, so you've got to get those increments right as you're doing the North Star. People have to know it's achievable, because in your bones, when you work at a company and you've got a ridiculous goal, no one cares anymore, right? But you've got an achievable goal, people will work as hard as possible to get it done. So this is not uncommon, by the way, in companies to need to do this North Star in this increment, because every company reaches an inflection point where they say, well, what has got us here is no longer enough, we now need to move to the next level. And that's where Suvoda was at. We found our center of gravity by focusing on what the teams do well. You know, you observe the teams, and we found that we had a sophisticated and powerful IRT system at the core of our platform. We could deliver quickly and iterate on it, but we needed key interventions in new platforms to ensure that the customization of those platforms and the tailoring for new clients was much more efficient. So that's our incremental approach. And I put there in purple, shut down parallel development, focus on core systems and APIs, and add no-code, low-code approach. So it's much more efficient to customize. We overly communicated the direction and the value. So we published every single comment, every single architectural decision as requests for comments. You probably heard some of the other speakers talk about RFCs. These are basically documents with a standard set of headings. I learned this technique from working at scale in investment banking, and we did the same thing at Riot, at Hulu, at LiveRamp, at Suvoda now. And we publish these and we indicate the relationship of the RFCs to other RFCs, and we allowed people to comment. Now, the key thing about RFCs is there's one owner. It's designed to be a coherent stream of thought where their job is to listen to feedback and take that into account. And that RFC then becomes that vehicle where they put forward their idea, and it rolls up conceptually to me so that I'm looking at the coherence of the architecture across everyone. We acknowledge mistakes and incorporate learning. More on that later. It's very important to be able to process negative feedback in a way which makes people more aligned rather than less aligned. I'm going to read out this thing. This is on Glassdoor, which is a comment from someone who actually left the company, so he had no reason to actually write nice things, but I think he got the point. So, and you can see a little bit of the history of the Suvoda inflection point as well. The main product was re-architected multiple times in the last 2 to 3 years. This is before I arrived. The first attempts resulted in failure. Not uncommon, again, right, at companies when you're trying to move to the next level. But the latest ones were very interesting since they hired at least one professional architect who came up with many great ideas. I didn't pay this person to write this, by the way. And he was allowed to put most of them into practice. The reconstruction of the architecture was made up to a certain point in a very transparent way using the concept of requests for comments. More specifically, the architectural documents were conceived by an owner. Very important to have that ownership, that single mind thinking through the problem. They were published on an internal website and everyone in the company could read and comment on them. Okay, fantastic, right? Because everyone can see where you're going. Of course, not everyone had the time to do so, another common problem of lack of attention, but the transparency principle gave the feeling that everyone is involved at this level. That's, game over, right? We've achieved transparency. Everyone knows where we're going and they've given feedback, so they feel like they bought in. And then we assessed, pivoted based on feedback. So we worked hard to create the psychological safety around giving negative feedback. The last thing I want is even a junior engineer feeding back negative complaints about the architecture and then getting shut down, right? That's a massive anti-pattern. If you get feedback, you learn to process it. Sometimes we get angry feedback, like, this architecture's terrible, you clearly don't understand what you're doing, we should be doing this instead. And you parse out the negative bits, which is, maybe I don't know what I'm doing, but probably by now I do. And you parse out those negative bits, and then you look at what they're proposing. Why are you proposing this? We like to talk to them. We like to understand and have them heard. And it's worked out pretty well. So this gets back to this over-communication principle. I never miss the chance to communicate the architecture again and over-communicate and communicate it again in different ways. It helps me understand it better. It helps me, as I refine my pitch, to basically be able to put it in a more succinct way. And it basically communicates and recommunicates and recommunicates to the point where everyone's heard it maybe at least 5 to 10 times, and they eventually get the ideas, even if they're not listening very hard. We have an engineering triumvirate. I find this very important in companies to have alignment at the top level. In our particular case, product I regard it as like the top of the tree. So product is vitally important. And then you have VP of engineering. We've got a fantastic VP of engineering called Priyanka. She keeps all the teams accountable. And then we've got the CPO and me doing the architecture. So those checks and balances, if something's going wrong on the engineering side, I'll correct it by talking to our VP of engineering. If the chief product officer doesn't like where we're heading architecturally, he'll take it up with me. Again, that balance is super important for us. Now, so I guess the fun bit or the sad bit, depending on how you define it, of the mistakes I've either made or seen, and how to avoid the classic pitfalls. These are the anti-patterns of setting a technical direction. I was lucky enough to be involved in a complete disaster of a project back in 2002. It's over 20 years ago, so I think I can talk about it with impunity, but it was at a venerable financial institution called the London Clearing House in London. And this is a company that built lots of COBOL-based systems and later C++-based systems to manage the risk profile of pretty much all the derivative trades running through London. And they had this idea, this consultancy came in and they had this idea to rewrite everything into one system where the core financial products were modeled as a series of cash flows. What happened is they then had the legacy teams. They called them legacy teams. You guys are losers. You're going by the way of the dodo. And then they had the next generation team. And this next generation team was treated as kings and an amazing royalty. And I was in the next generation side. And I liked the feeling that we were treated so well for a while. But then I realized that it's a disaster waiting to happen. Because these systems that they call legacy are systems that are delivering immense value and have delivered immense value for 30 years. They have zillions of business cases and corner cases in it, and all of a sudden they're hoping to rewrite everything in this way. Now, just the very fact of this parallel development means that it's very hard, even if you did it perfectly right, it's very hard to catch this moving train of these legacy systems as they go forward. It's very hard to move people onto it, and lo and behold, it failed. It failed so badly they had to write off the project and show the tax department in England that they destroyed the source code to get the tax write-off. But it was such a fantastic experience for me. Although it was very painful at the time, it's a fantastic experience because I saw everything that could go wrong with these projects. It was a really great learning point for me. Classic mistake to avoid, and this is very, very prominent when you're trying to rewrite a system, right, is not delivering incremental gains, right? If you don't deliver incremental gains to the business, someone's going to come along and go, I'm not waiting 3 years anymore for you to finish this technology project, which might have an uncertain outcome. I want some value now. So at Suvoda, every single step we make forward towards the North Star architecture has got a business value. Super important, otherwise someone will come along and cancel it. Now, an argument could be made every now and again, and I'll talk about this project later, you do have to rewrite a system. And that's absolutely fine. But when I rewrite now, I try and scope it down to the smallest thing I can rewrite as possible, right? Because I want it to be in a bounded context, and there's always value in existing systems. It's a massive anti-pattern to devalue the teams that built the system that got you to this point, and then try and re-engineer it. Classic mistake to avoid, and I alluded to this earlier, is this big vision that can't be achieved. Often you'll go to a company and they've got, we want to create this amazing SaaS system that services half the world doing this, that, and the other. And the teams are just like, I don't know what you're talking about. Now, the reason that's such a massive anti-pattern Again, I mentioned it earlier, is when people know something is achievable, they'll work so hard to get it done because it's within grasping distance and they see the greatness of getting to that point and they'll work really hard. When they think something is not achievable, they're suddenly working to rule 9 to 5, I'm going home, it'll never work. And the London Clearinghouse project was the epitome of a death march, right? Everyone knew it wouldn't work. They felt as we were going along it wouldn't work, so they stopped trying. Here's a classic mistake that I made when I was chief architect of LiveRamp. See those problems there? You've got like 4 white bubbles and a big red bubble. I focused on one of the bigger white bubbles. I didn't focus on the core of the problem, which was how the big data processing pipeline was working. Now, I wasn't alone in that. You know, the upper management, etc., were also very interested in one of the white bubbles. But the reality is I didn't focus at the time on that big bubble in the middle, that big problem. And then, thankfully, LiveRamp have rectified that later. I'm on very good terms with them. It's a complex problem, but I see this in a lot of companies. In particular, when there's a large monolith with a lot of old business logic in it, people stay away from the monolith and they go, I'm going to solve that problem over there and that problem over there. But they know it won't really result in much. You've got to attack the heart of the problem, even if it's hard, and work to that North Star and that incremental step forward. Because otherwise you're just delaying the inevitable. Another mistake to avoid, and I see this a lot, right? Every 5 years or so there's another hype train. For a long while it was, let's turn everything into microservices. And you're like, what's the benefit of that? And they go, I don't know, it'll be easier to run and manage. And I can tell you as someone who has been chief architect at a company where we created 800 microservices in 2 years, there can be a lot of problems with managing those, but in addition, it can interact very badly with things like customizability. So what I do when I go into companies is I look at this, and I'm lucky enough to have a lot of experience, so I look at it and say, well, why do you want to turn everything into microservices? They go, we've heard it's better, and it's like, well, not necessarily. I remember talking to the chief architect at Slack, and a large part of Slack is a monolith written in PHP. They're ex-Facebook engineers, and I remember talking to the chief architect, Keith, and saying to him, why don't you turn that into microservices? And he answered in the best possible way. Why? What's the business benefit? We find it really easy to work in this monolith. So again, you've got to have a valid business reason to do everything. Another mistake to avoid, and we made this mistake at Riot Games when we were re-architecting the League of Legends game client. To put this into context, this is when I left the company, it had been on 150 million desktops. It was probably one of the largest games played in history, 2.5 billion hours a month. And we weren't clear enough. There's too much politics going on. We weren't clear enough explaining to people and processing negative feedback. They made a game or a player processing negative feedback, but what they were really doing is listening to the negative feedback and then undermining the people behind the scenes. Got very political. It wasn't until we actually started listening to people's valid objections and processing them without emotion that we started moving forward. And when you do that, people will champion your cause and it will start percolating through the company. Another classic mistake that people make, and this is an unusual one, right, is they don't manage upwards. What can happen is a lot of things can go wrong if you don't manage upwards. In particular, the CEO and others can get disconnected from you. So they're like, well, why don't we do this opportunity instead of the one you're heading towards? So it's really important to manage upwards as well as downwards. Now, you could see it as a slightly bitter thing. At Riot Games, we delivered the lead client, and then people who had just been sitting on the sidelines swept in and said, we're taking ownership now. That's a classic anti-pattern because those people weren't involved with the riskiness of doing the process, and they didn't get the learnings of doing it, and they weren't capable of necessarily carrying off the project in the first place. Now, from an engineering perspective, why that's bad is those people are now in charge, but they don't have the learnings, and so it creates engineering inefficiency. So from one perspective, it can look you could say, well, Andrew, you're just being bitter because other people came and took it over. But the problem is that engineering efficiency is really important, so you want to move forward with those learnings. So just a summary and insights. Every company, actually, in my experience, has the core knowledge and expertise already to create a successful technical direction that is achievable. They have it collectively, they're just not so great at getting alignment. A good direction allows value increments in a conservative way without sacrificing speed of delivery. getting alignment is a whole nother talk, but is a valuable skill to develop. I'm, at this point, a consensus-generating machine. I can take in all these feedback signals and stuff like that and turn it into a direction where everyone goes, I love that, that's really good. And processing negative and positive feedback is a learned skill. We learned that at Riot Games. They spent a lot of time discussing how to process feedback, in particular, divorcing the sentiment, which sometimes can be extremely negative, from the substance of the feedback. So that's it in a nutshell. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was such an informative talk, so many lessons, and I loved hearing from all the mistakes as well, because those are just a great way to learn what not to do.
Probably too many mistakes.
Yeah, so we have about only a few minutes for questions, so I'm just going to jump right into it. Got one that is definitely one that I've heard a lot about, people bring up, which is, how do you manage getting clarity on the product direction when product partners are not fully aligned themselves and keep pivoting direction?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. Like in an ideal world, right, the product owners are having enough clarity to derive the direction forward. If you don't have full clarity, you can get sub-clarity. Like I've had companies like that where they don't really know where they're going, but you get clarity on parts of the system. And the aim here is to get clarity enough that these are durable steps forward. So you have to divide the problem space then, and you have to work and essentially become like a product partner. And you have to make sure that the product people understand. And so you build up the consensus from the ground up rather than taking the direction from the top down.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. I've had those situations too, and yeah, you really just need to work with them and sort of slowly put the pieces together. Okay, on to the next one. Let's see. How do you get exec buy-in for a long-term investment if engineering department historically has been seen as not delivering on promises previously?
Yeah, and that's a tough one.
Yeah, they're really giving you tough ones.
Yeah, look, I've been at a company where the new sort of engineering team comes in, and you've got to basically work, then put your engineering hat on and work to get consistency across increments, because delivering slowly but reliably and on time is often a precursor to then being able to go a bit faster and become a bit more ambitious. So that is a wider problem, right? That is related to engineering execution. And in our case, we've got, as I said, an amazing VP of engineering called Priyanka, and she's like, why didn't you deliver on time? I'm very bad at this, by the way. My kids never did their homework, but she's like, why didn't you deliver on time? Why haven't you done that? And then she'll debug it and make sure they do. So yeah, the truth is that is a bigger problem than just engineering setting goals. That is basically debugging the teams and making sure that they can deliver more reliably.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. It seems like a kind of pre-requirement to get down. I like this next one. This is probably the last one we could do, which is, how do you know an initiative is unachievable? Or I'll add to it, I would say, how can you make it, one of those high-level goals that people can believe in, that it is achievable?
Yeah, it's a really good point, but you know, if you, like I'm a working architect, I like to dig into the code, I like to write some of the code myself. You know, when you're working with a team, when you see their velocity, when you see what they're capable of, you can assess what they're good at, and then you customize the North Star to find that balance between what is achievable, because you really know how far they're going to be able to get. You talk to some of the programmers and you say, well, could you do this? And it might be quite a complex idea. And they go, I don't even know what you're talking about. That's a good indication that it's probably a bit more in the sort of realm of unachievable. Like, in particular at Suvoda, we had to shut down an entire project because as I was talking to the team, I realized that the ideas not only weren't getting through, but they didn't understand them at all. Now, again, different people, different times, different capabilities. It's basically a value judgment that comes down, in my case, to saying, we can achieve this is why, and then the teams will go, yeah, we can do that. There's no substitute for feedback on that one.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, just getting buy-in from the people who will be doing it. So, yeah. Cool. We got one last question that I've been doing for all speakers.
Okay.
So, what is one book that you would recommend to the audience that has changed the way you work or live your life?
There is one book, it's called The First 90 Days. I can't remember the author, maybe someone Watkins. When I used to move between companies, it outlines a set of steps you can take to ensure success when you move to a company as an executive. And that's helped me immensely over the years, because it's amazing how much the first 90 days can actually set the tone for the rest of your tenure.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. It's been a pleasure. Everyone give him a round of applause.